The Garmin Venu 3 and 3S are surprisingly well-rounded smartwatches, and I would have no problem recommending them to some of my friends. However, my systematic testing did reveal a number of limitations of this watch, and these might be deal breakers for some of you. In this video, we're gonna scientifically test the heart rate tracking performance, sleep stage tracking accuracy, GPS consistency, and oxygen saturation measurements of the Garmin Venu 3 and 3S. Now, this is the video many of you have been waiting for, so let's get to it. Hello everyone, for those of you that are new to the channel, my name is Rob and I'm a postdoctoral scientist specializing in biological data analysis. In this video, I'll dive straight into the testing. However, if you do want to find out more about the detailed specs of this watch, luckily Garmin has a very good website that lists all of the details. Now, the only really important thing to mention is that the Venu 3 has Garmin's latest generation sensor set. But that's all I wanted to say before we get to the systematic testing, and I want to start off with the heart rate tracking performance, which I tested on myself with the Venu 3 and on Teresa with the 3S. I tested the heart rate tracking performance during a total of 7 indoor cycling sessions, 3 runs, 21 bike rides and 10 weightlifting sessions. Let's get to it. I will start off by looking at the performance of the Venu 3 during indoor cycling, which is a relatively easy exercise for a watch to track given the limited movement and lack of tension on my arm. And here you can see an overview of the results. Now, to test the performance, I'll compare the heart rate measurements of the Garmin Venu 3 against the Polar H10 ECG chest strap, which can generally record my heart rate very accurately. Now, each dot here is a single heart rate measurement with along the horizontal axis the value according to the Polar H10 ECG chest strap, and on the vertical axis the value according to the Garmin Venu 3. Now, the closer the points are to the blue line, the better the agreement, and the darker black the color, the more dots that there are. And as you can see, there's an overall pretty decent agreement between the Venu 3 and the Polar H10. We can see most points are on or close to the blue line, especially in the higher heart rate range. Only in the medium to low heart rate ranges there are a bit more deviation. We see some points below it, meaning it detected a too low heart rate, but we see especially many points above it, meaning it detected a too high heart rate. Now, the correlation is 0.93, which is pretty okay. It's not the best, but pretty decent. This R value, the correlation, cannot be higher than 1, so a correlation of 0.93 is pretty good. Now, because we have these points above the blue line right here, my suspicion is that in between my intervals, when my heart rate was dropping, the Garmin Venu 3 wasn't fully able to detect this and sometimes detected a too high heart rate. But we need to take a look at those individual training sessions to see if this is indeed the case. And here we have the first example interval spinning session where we see a pretty decent agreement between the Garmin Venu 2 and the ECG chest strap. Now, along the horizontal axis we have the time and my heart rate is along the vertical axis, with in blue-green my heart rate according to the Polar H10 ECG chest strap, and in red my heart rate according to the Venu 3. Now, for this ride the agreement is more or less perfect, except for during the break after this first interval where the Venu 3 wasn't able to fully detect this dip in my heart rate, but otherwise it looks really good. And other spinning sessions look more or less the same with an almost perfect agreement, but we do see some consistent small issues. For instance, during this spinning session right here, the Venu 3 wasn't able to detect this dip in my heart rate right here. And that's what seems to be the general problem. Also right here, the dip wasn't fully detected. And that's also what we see during some other spinning sessions, where at least for the first part when I'm taking a rest in between my intervals, the Venu 3 just isn't able to fully detect that dip in my heart rate, or at least not at first. And this is a more or less consistent issue it has on me. We see that right here as well and also right here. Now, this isn't a major issue, but definitely something to be aware of. Now, that's honestly not looking too bad so far. However, to get a clearer understanding of how the Garmin Venu 3 compares to the competition, let's put these results into context. Let's compare it against dozens of different watches I've previously tested. This way you can determine if there's potentially a better watch out there for you. And that overview is displayed right here. Now, the correlation value I was talking about before is the metric I'll use for this, which is displayed along the horizontal axis. And we want that value to be as close to 1 as possible. And on the vertical axis, I ordered the watches from worst to best. So the further to the right and the higher a device is, the better is its correlation with the reference device. And here I marked the Garmin Venu 3 in red. And as you can see, it's doing pretty decently, I would say, though there are quite a few watches that are doing better. So we can see a big row of watches above it, but we need to zoom in to actually read those labels. And that zoomed in view is displayed right here with just the watches of a correlation of 0.9 or higher. And as you can see, the Garmin Venu 3 is actually close to the Forerunner 965 and also the Phoenix 7. And surprisingly, to me at least, in my testing, is doing a bit worse than the Phoenix 7 Pro and the Epix 2 Pro, which have the same sensor. As I said, it's actually closer to the Forerunner 965 and the Phoenix 7, so with the original sensor. So I'm not sure what's going on here. I did quite a few rides with all of them, and I would have expected the Venu 3 to end up closer to the other watches with the same sensor. But maybe some processing power plays some role, I'm not sure. More testing is needed, and I might also test it on some of my other friends to see what's going on here. But for now, this is still a pretty decent result. Now, as I said, there's definitely better watches out there, like some Apple Watches, the Pixel Watch, but still it's not a bad result. For most people, this will likely be good enough. And also for Teresa, it does seem to perform a bit better. I didn't test it on her for spinning, but as you will see for the other exercises, it did do a bit better on her than on me. So individual physiology might also play a role. Overall, this is likely good enough, though we can definitely see some points of improvement for the Venu 3. However, let's now take a look at the next most difficult exercise for a watch to track, running outside. Now, running outside increases the bumpiness during exercise. However, there's still little tension on my arm and wrist, so it's only slightly harder for the watch to get a clean heart rate signal. Let's see how the Venu 3 did. And an overview of that is displayed right here, similar to before, but now for running, with on the left the results for me and on the right the results for Teresa. And luckily, again, we see that most points are again on or close to the blue line. And for Teresa, it even looks a bit better than it did for me. So Teresa's correlation is 0.99, which is really good. And for me, the correlation is 0.95, which is pretty good. I'm overall not so disappointed with this. We do see again that for me in the medium to lower heart rate range, there's a bit of deviation. But let's take a look at some of those individual training sessions. And here we have an overview similar to before with again the Polar H10 in blue and the Garmin Venu 3 in red. And as you can see, there's a pretty good agreement between the chest strap and the Venu 3. More or less the same heart rate is detected, only right here is there a dip in my heart rate that wasn't fully detected. But overall, no big complaints here. If we look at this second run, we again see the same thing. It generally agrees pretty well. Only in the dips in my heart rate do we see some issues, but these are relatively minor. And if we look at Teresa's run, this looks even better. Now, Teresa only did a single run, but overall this looks very good. The Garmin Venu 3 and Polar H10 basically detected the same heart rate. There's only some minor deviation right here, but this is really minor. Now, this is a similar overview plot to before, but now for running. And I only have a limited number of watches here since I only recently started running. But as you can see, the Garmin Venu 3 in red is doing pretty decently. There are definitely some watches doing a bit better, like the Google Pixel Watch, the Coral Space 2 and the Apple Watches. But I would say that a correlation of 0.95 is definitely good enough. However, let's now look at the performance of the Venu 3 during a more difficult exercise for a watch to track, cycling outside. Now, cycling outside increases the tension on my arms because I have to hold on to the handlebars, and there's also much more movement and bumpiness, making it much harder for a watch to get a clean heart rate signal. I tested the Garmin Venu 3 for a total of 21 bike rides. However, first a quick side note. If you're interested in the latest updates on the wearables I'm testing, I'm planning to start back up with my newsletter and posting more off-the-cuff things on my Instagram and my YouTube Shorts channel. So if you're interested in any of those are linked below. If you want to help me and get access to watches sooner, it would really help if you like, subscribe and comment. But of course, this is totally up to you. Now, enough self-promotion. Let's take a look at the performance of the Venu 3 during cycling. And an overview of that is displayed right here, similar to what we were looking at before, but now for cycling outside, with on the left the results for me and on the right the results for Teresa. Now, one thing you will notice is that there's many more points for me than for Teresa. So I did 20 bike rides and Teresa only 1. So I think the results on me are in terms of numbers most reliable, but of course we do have different physiologies. Now for Teresa, the results with a correlation of 0.96 look a lot better than they do for me with 0.79. Though again, for Teresa, we only have 1 bike ride, so take those results with a grain of salt. For me, we see that in most cases the points are on or close to the blue line, But there are quite a few points below the blue line. So let's take a look at the individual bike rides to see what's going on right here. Now for biking, the results are really mixed. Some rides are really good, like this ride right here, for instance, where we see a very good agreement between the Venu 3 in red and the H10 in blue. But there are also bike rides where the results aren't as good. For instance, this bike ride right here, where it had some delay in picking up the increases in my heart rate. For instance, right here, and right here. Now, as I said, there's also many more good bike rides, like for instance, this one right here, where we see a very good agreement between the Polar H10 and the Venu 3. But we also see for many rides a consistent issue of not being able to detect that increase in my heart rate quickly enough. So for instance, right here, and right here, we see that. And we can also see that for this last example I wanted to share with you. Now overall, this isn't that bad, but just be aware there could be some delay in it picking up a change in your heart rate, though in the end it will pick up on your heart rate correctly. But let's also take a look at Teresa's bike ride. And here we have the results for Teresa's bike ride, which looks very good and looks more like the better examples for me. So we only have one bike ride for Teresa, so we cannot say for sure if she consistently gets better results, but at least for this one bike ride it looks good. And again, here's a similar overview to before, but now for cycling outside with the Venu 3 marked in red. And as you can see, it's doing pretty decently. It's among some of the medium to high performing watches. But again, we need to zoom into these results to actually read the labels. And those results are displayed right here. So these are just the watches with a correlation of 0.7 or higher. And as you can see, it's doing quite well, though not amazing. It's actually quite close to what I would say is the previous generation of Garmin watches, or at least the previous generation of sensor. So the Garmin Instinct 2, the Forerunner 255, the Garmin Venu 2, the Epix 2 Pro and 7 Pro are actually a bit lower. So these have the newer sensor, but are quite a bit heavier. So maybe here the Venu 3 has an edge over the Phoenix 7 Pro and the Epix 2 Pro. But overall, this isn't bad, though also not amazing. We can also see that the Coral Space 3 seem to be doing a bit better. But some Huawei watches, potentially also the Pixel Watch 2, and especially some Apple watches are doing better than the Venu 3. And you can decide for yourself based on the results on me, which are displayed right here, or the results I showed you for Teresa. Is this good enough for you? Finally, let's take a look at weightlifting, which is generally one of the most difficult exercises for a watch to track because of the extremely high tension on my wrist and my arm during each set. And again, this is a similar overview plot to before, but now for weightlifting, with on the left the results for me and on the right for Teresa. And again, for Teresa, the results look a lot better than they did for me. The correlation for Teresa is 0.91 with most of the points on or close to the blue line. But for me, the correlation is much lower at 0.77 and many more points away from the blue line, especially below it right here. So again, here it seems that at least on Teresa's physiology and the way that she does the exercises, it performs much better on her. Now, I'm honestly not sure why the watch seems to do better on Teresa than on me. I do tend to do more upper body exercises which are harder, and Teresa just has a different physiology, so maybe overall the watch will always just do a bit better on her. But let's take a look at some of those individual weightlifting sessions. And here we have the first example weightlifting session with again the Polar H10 in blue and the Venu 3 in red. And as you can see, based on the blue peaks, each time I did a set of exercises, my heart rate increased. And in many cases, the Venu 3 was able to detect this, but also in many cases it wasn't. So here in the beginning, it looks pretty decent. And also towards the end, it looks pretty good. But some of the peaks are not fully detected, for instance, right here. And also some peaks are completely missed, like for instance, this one right here and these ones right here. But let's take a look at some other examples. And for this second example, we see that for the first part of the training, it did pretty good. But then for the second 2/3 or so of the training, most of the peaks in my heart rate weren't detected. So it's a bit hit and miss. Other training sessions are a bit in between, like this one right here, where some peaks are detected and others aren't. And for this example, this last one for me, I wanted to show you, we can see that for many of the peaks in my heart rate, the Venu 3 just stopped detecting my heart rate, as you can see right here, for instance, and right here. And out of all weightlifting sessions, this was the one where it struggled most. Now for Teresa, it actually looks significantly better, as you can see right here during the first example, where most of the peaks in her heart rate were accurately detected, only here in the middle was a bit missed. And some of her training sessions look really good, like this one right here, where it's basically spot on, whereas for others it struggled a bit, like for this one right here, where maybe half of the training it was pretty accurate, but for the other half it wasn't. So overall, this does give me the impression that the Venu 3S on Teresa is doing slightly better than the Venu 3 on me. Still, overall, for all exercises, both are doing pretty decently. Now again, this is an overview of many of the watches that I've tested with the Venu 3 marked in red. And as you can see, for weightlifting, it's doing okay compared to other watches. It's definitely in the middle upper class of watches, but let's again zoom in. And that's displayed right here. So these are all the watches with a correlation of 0.7 or higher. And again, the Venu 3 is close to some other Garmin watches like the Venu 2, the Epix 2 Pro, the Phoenix 7 Pro, the Forerunner 965. So overall, it's not doing that much better than other Garmin watches, also some with the older generation sensor, but it's also not doing poorly. So it's not bad, but also not good for weightlifting. Generally, if you want to track your heart rate during weightlifting, I would really recommend using an ECG chest strap. This is just the most reliable way of measuring your heart rate, and especially for weightlifting, this is very important. If you really don't want to use an ECG chest strap, select one of the watches with a correlation of 0.95 or potentially 0.9 or higher, and these might be good enough. So for instance, the Pixel Watch 2, some Huawei watches, and especially Apple watches are really accurate for weightlifting. Now, honestly, this looks pretty decent for the Venu 3, I would say. It's not amazing, but it's pretty good. It's not as good as, for instance, Apple watches, but it's probably good enough for many of you for some of the exercises. Therefore, I'd give the heart rate tracking of the Venu 3 between 3.5 and maybe even 4 out of 5 stars. Next, let's take a look at the sleep state tracking of the Venu 3, which I tested during a total of 7 nights. Now, to test the sleep state tracking performance, I'll compare the Venu 3 against the Z-Max EEG headband, which can actually measure my brain waves. Now, this device also has its limitations, especially when it comes to detecting awake time. I discussed this limitation in several of my recent videos, so I won't go into the details here, but what it boils down to is that I'll mostly ignore the awake time detection in the analysis. And here you can see an overview of the sleep test results. On top are the sleep stages as recorded by the Z-Max EEG device, and on the left are the sleep stages as recorded by the Venu 3. Now each column here sums to 100%, meaning that we can see what percentage of each of the sleep stages according to the Z-Max was predicted as each sleep stage by the Venu 3. And if they perfectly agree, all values on the diagonal should be 100%. Now, first of all, we see that 93% of what was deep sleep according to the Z-Max was also recorded as deep sleep by the Venu 3, so that's pretty good. If there was any confusion, this was mostly with light sleep. Now, looking at the individual nights will help us understand it even better, and here we can see the first night I wanted to share with you. On top, we have the sleep stages as recorded by the Z-Max EEG headband, with along the horizontal axis the clock time and my sleep stages on the vertical axis. And on the bottom, we have a similar plot, but now for the Venu 3. And in purple here, I highlighted the deep sleep as recorded by the EEG device. And as you can see, there's a pretty good agreement between the EEG device and the Venu 3. They basically detected the same deep sleep here in the beginning of the night, only later on that the Venu 3 detected a bit of extra deep sleep. But overall, this looks really good. Now for this second example night I wanted to share with you, we see more or less the same thing. Again, all of the deep sleep that the EEG device detected was also detected by the Venu 3, only some extra deep sleep was detected. And this is more or less what we see for all nights. So also for this example right here, there's a pretty good deep sleep agreement. Light sleep agreement seems pretty decent at 69%. Now, if the Venu 3 did predict light sleep as something different than the Z-Max, this was mostly as deep sleep, but also sometimes as awake time or REM sleep. Now, REM sleep agreement at the surface doesn't seem amazing at a 47% agreement, and about the same amount was predicted as light sleep instead by the Venu 3. But we really need to look at the individual nights here to see what's going on. Now, if we look at the individual nights, we see that the REM sleep agreement isn't actually as bad as it seems. Now, for instance, for this first example right here, I had 1, 2, 3, 4 REM sleep segments, I would say, and all of them were also detected by the Venu 3. Just the duration and the exact location wasn't exactly the same, but overall this actually doesn't look that bad. Looking at this second example night, we see that the Venu 3 detected 4 out of 5 REM sleep segments. So detected the first one and the last 3, but not this one right here. And this is generally what I see for most of the nights. The REM sleep that is detected by the Venu 3 tends to match with the EEG device, but maybe not exactly in duration, but it does sometimes miss 1 or 2 of the segments. And if you look at this night right here, the first 2 REM sleep segments were missed. So this also means we can see some but not all of the sleep cycles based on just the data from the Venu 3. So for this night right here, I likely had 1, 2, 3, 4, probably 5 sleep cycles, and the Venu 3 would only be able to detect 3 of them, so the last 3. But in the beginning of the night, it just missed my REM sleep. Now, as I said, we won't be focusing on the awake time, but just for completeness, here we see that about 35% of what the EEG device predicted as being awake time time was also predicted as awake time by the Garmin Venu 3. About the same amount was predicted as light sleep, which makes sense as light sleep is the closest sleep stage to being awake. Now I also don't trust the Zmax here in terms of awake time, but let's quickly look at the individual nights. What I found interesting to see is that the Venu 3 tended to be quite sensitive to detecting awake moments. Now for this first night that isn't that apparent, so here I've marked the awake moments according to the EEG device in green, and the Venu 3 only had a few awake moments, but for other nights the Venu 3 tended to detect quite long awake moments, for instance here in the beginning of the night, and that's also what we see for this night right here, where it had some longer awake time here in the beginning of the night, but when it did detect awake moments it did tend to match with the EEG device generally. So also for this night right here, for instance, it tended to detect quite long awake moments, but I find it a bit difficult to judge since I cannot really rely on the EEG device in terms of awake time. Still, generally, I'm quite happily surprised so far with the sleep tracking performance of the Venu 3. Okay, that doesn't look bad, but also not amazing, honestly, I'd say. So to show you how the Venu 3 performs compared to other watches, let's put these results into perspective. This graph shows you an overview of the agreement of different watches with different reference devices. Along the horizontal axis, we have the average agreement over the individual sleep stages, and on the vertical axis, we have the agreement of the worst sleep stage. Now, the better the agreement, the more to the top right the device is. Now, as I mentioned in previous videos, this overview is slightly complicated because I use different reference devices. The devices marked in green right here were tested against the Zmax EEG device, so the same one we used in this video. The devices marked in blue-purple were tested against a polysomnography device, so the gold standard in sleep stage tracking. And the devices not marked in any color were tested against the Dream 2 EEG headband, my normal reference, but I cannot use it anymore because Dream went bankrupt. Luckily, no matter what reference device I use, the patterns are more or less the same. Apple Watches are some of the best performers, followed by, for instance, Fitbit and Oura Ring, and Huawei watches and Mi Bands, for instance, aren't that great at sleep stage tracking. If we now plot the Venu 3 in the same plot, it does pretty okay. Maybe unsurprisingly, it's close to some other Garmin devices, though we are using a different reference here, so we should be a bit careful, but it's super close to, for instance, the Forerunner 255, Phoenix 7, Forerunner 965, Epix 2 Pro, Phoenix 7 Pro, and Vivomove Sport. And as we just saw, by looking at the individual nights, we get more nuance than just looking at their percentages. So the REM sleep percentage was actually pretty low, but we saw it actually detected many of the REM sleep segments. So overall, the Venu 3 is a pretty decent sleep stage tracker, I'd say. There are better devices out there, but it might be good enough for many of you. Just be aware of the limitations. Now, as I said, in this overview, you can also see what are some of the best sleep stage trackers. Especially Apple Watches are good. Also, the H-Sleep Pod 3 is a really good sleep stage tracker, but also really expensive. Other pretty good devices include, for instance, the Oura Ring, the Whoop strap, but also many Fitbit devices. But I would suggest looking at some of those videos if sleep tracking is your focus. So the Venu 3 sleep stage tracking definitely isn't terrible, but be aware that there are better devices out there. If you just want a general approximation of your total sleep time and some idea of your deep sleep and some of your REM sleep segments, then the Venu 3 might suffice. But if you want to dive deeper into your sleep stages, you might consider getting, for instance, an Apple Watch instead. Or if you're looking for both accurate sleep stage tracking and some better insights into your sleep quality, then devices like, for instance, the Oura Ring, the H-Sleep Pod 3 or the Whoop strap could be better choices. In summary, I would rate the sleep stage tracking of the Venu 3 at about 3.5 out of 5 stars. Now let's shift our focus to a feature that most Garmin watches are particularly good at, the GPS or location tracking. The way I'll test the location tracking is by cycling the same route several times, going to and from work, and checking if the signals overlap, which would be good, or if there's actually a big divergence between the recorded signals, which would be bad. And for those of you who are interested in the details of the testing, I had the GPS set to all systems to potentially get the best accuracy. Let's first look at the results for 8 times I cycled to work. Now, I always started my workout right on the corner here, and I didn't give the watch any extra time to acquire the signal. And the green markers indicate the moment that it did acquire the signal. So in all cases, the Venu 3 basically instantly acquired the signal, which is really good. There is a bit of deviation about where exactly it has that initial point, but overall this doesn't look that bad. Let's now look at the consistency between the rides, and this also looks pretty okay, I would say. We need to zoom out a little bit. So if we zoom out now, we see that the signals are pretty consistent. They're more or less in the same location with sometimes a bit of deviation, but overall this isn't that bad. Then if we go along the route, there's a bit of deviation right here, but still not bad. It's basically just one of the signals that is a bit deviant. We see a bit of deviation right here, still not terrible. And then here it looks pretty good. Here the results are pretty consistent and most of the signals overlap, with maybe one slightly deviating signal right here and one slightly deviating right here. Still overall not bad, I would say. And then looking along the route, this is pretty good. Generally here at the end of my ride, many watches struggle and also the Venu 3 struggles here. Still overall, this is pretty good, I would say. Not amazing. I've seen better results from some Garmin watches, but still it looks pretty good and I suspect it is good enough for many people. Now I also recorded my route 7 times cycling back from work, and also in this case the signals were acquired almost instantly. So I always started the route right here and all the markers are super close to that position, so that looks pretty good. Now looking at the consistency between the signals, this also looks pretty okay, I would say. We need to zoom out a bit. There is some deviation here, again at the same location that we also saw for cycling to work. Then going along the route, the signals get more consistent. Here it looks really good. There's a bit of deviation right here, or basically one signal deviating a bit from the rest, but still a pretty good result, I would say. There is some deviation right here and right here, but still compared to many other watches, this is pretty good. Also right here, there's some deviation. In this location right here, I would say there's quite a significant deviation. This is where many watches struggle, and we see something similar for the Venu 3, though it's not very extreme. The signals are still pretty close together. Then right here, I took a few times a different route, but here and here we can see that for the 2 different routes, the signals are pretty consistent. And then going along, it looks quite okay. We normally see at the radio station down here, there's a bit more deviation. And yes, we see the same thing right here for the Venu 3. For some reason here in the Funkhaus, there's always a bit more deviation. I'm not sure if there's actually any signals coming from here, but also the Venu 3 suffers. Still overall, later on, the signals get pretty consistent and I'm not disappointed. Some other Garmin watches potentially did a bit better, but still overall, for me, this would likely be good enough. But you can decide for yourself based on the performance I just showed you, is the Venu 3 good enough for your use case? So the GPS tracking performance of the Garmin Venu 3 is quite good, I would say. It wasn't perfect, and as I mentioned before, I still have to work out a way of quantifying the performance, but generally it's among some of the better watches out there for this purpose. Therefore, overall, I'd give the GPS tracking 4 out of 5 stars. Finally, let's take a quick look at the oxygen saturation measurements of the Venu 3. I actually tested the Venu 3 in a low oxygen environment to see if we can detect a lowered oxygen saturation. Specifically, I tested it in an airplane cabin, which has decreased air pressure during the flight, which in the end leads to a reduced oxygen saturation of my blood. And in this graph right here, you can see how my oxygen saturation varied during my first flight according to one of my reference devices. So on the vertical axis, we have my oxygen saturation, along the horizontal axis, the clock time, and in pink, I plotted my oxygen saturation as recorded by the reference device. Now the reference device is a ring that uses transmittance pulse oximetry, which isn't perfect. It has some noise, but it clearly shows us when it was before the flight, when the flight took off and my oxygen saturation started decreasing, when I was in flight and my oxygen saturation was low, so around 90%. Then as the plane descended again, my oxygen saturation increased again to normal levels. And we would hope to see similar patterns based on the Venu 3's measurements. And those are displayed right here. So in green now I plotted measurements of the Venu 3. And as you can see, it didn't really show a dip in my oxygen saturation measurements. It might have decreased a little bit right here, but I wouldn't say that the measurements taken in flight are that much lower compared to the measurements before takeoff and after landing. So overall, this doesn't look very good, but I also took it with me on a second flight. And this is the second flight right here with again my reference in pink and the Venu 3 in green. And for this flight, for some reason, not that many of the measurements were actually stored by the Venu 3. And I do have some pictures of them, but I'm not sure if then something was wrong with those measurements. So I'm only showing the ones that were actually stored in the device. So there aren't that many measurements in flight, but I would say that this one and this one were probably during the flight and they're still at normal levels. And this is also what I remember from taking the measurements. So no matter if it was before takeoff, during the flight or after landing, the measurements tended to be more or less the same and they should have been lower during the flight. So I take this as a first indication that at least on me, the Venu 3 doesn't seem to be that good at taking oxygen saturation measurements. But these are just my observations. Please also check out the reviews of some other reviewers. So the on-demand oxygen saturation measurements of the Venu 3 do not look that great, honestly. I'd like to test it on more people, but based on my first test, I'm not impressed. I therefore give the oxygen saturation measurements of the Venu 3 2 out of 5 stars. Now, before getting to my final conclusions, let's briefly list some of the limitations of this test and the general type of testing I perform. 1. Most tests are just done on me or maybe on a second person. 2. I only test the devices for a limited number of time. 3. My sleep reference isn't perfect. Still, I do believe that this kind of systematic testing gives us a rough impression of which watches are good and which watches are bad, but also check out some other reviewers. But okay, what are the final conclusions on the Venu 3 and 3S? Well, I think that they're pretty solid all-round smartwatches with pretty good heart rate tracking, decent sleep stage tracking and good GPS tracking. Only the oxygen saturation measurements disappointed me a bit. The Venu 3 also has very good battery life compared to many of the other watches out there, lasting up to 27 days, so it's really a very good all-rounder, but it also doesn't dazzle me with its performance in any particular category. So taking all of this into consideration, I'd give the Venu 3 between 3.5 and 4 out of 5 stars. Now, if you do decide to get a Garmin Venu 3, a Whoop strap, an Oura ring, another device, or anything at all on Amazon for that matter, even something as small as toilet paper, and you potentially want to save some money and also support the channel, there are different affiliate and non-affiliate links in the description below. They do not cost you any extra and some even provide a discount. Now, given that you watched this whole video on the Garmin Venu 3, check out this video on the new Coral Space 3 or this video on my top recommendations for sports and health tracking. In the meantime, thank you so much for watching and catch you in the next video.